The next tip that I want to explore with you is to learn to develop a research question where you connect a particular topic to a broader set of ideas about how media influence society. And in this next section of our journey through media technologies and social change, we're going to be thinking in more detail about how the impact of Wikileaks, and what the impact of Wikileaks really means can be explored in relation to some of the ideas that have been circulating in media studies for really some time. Some general ideas about the general sorts of relationships between media technology and democracy in particular, that have been applied to other media environments, other media technologies, and other media practices. And the purpose of doing that is to think about which of the debates connected to WikiLeaks and the power of digital media reflect concerns that have been around long before digital media were with us. So the point I'm trying to make is that it always helps in your research if you can connect your topic to a bigger question, something that appeals to an overall question about media and social well-being that's likely to interest a wide range of people other than those who are interested in your topic in particular. So it may be that you're not particularly interested in WikiLeaks, but imagine that if I'm writing this for someone who isn't interested in WikiLeaks, my job as a researcher is to explain them why the topic of WikiLeaks is actually about things that they should care about. So I suppose, somebody might say, look, I'm not really interested in WikiLeaks. I don't much care for Julian Assange. I think he's kind of, he's a bit too much of a show pony for me. I think he's less interesting than everyone seems to think he is. And the way to approach that is to say, well, that doesn't really matter what you think about that, because I'm going to explain to you how Julian Assange and WikiLeaks do represent a question that's been around for a long time. And that's the question of, does better, quicker, faster media technology make for better democracy? And that's you may not be interested in Julian Assange, but he's certainly part of that question. And that's a question that has long historical roots. And in being able to point to those historical roots, you can really persuade someone why your topic's worth looking at. So I suppose there are a few ideas that we can use to connect WikiLeaks to some big questions about media and technology that have been around for a long time. And the first is the idea that WikiLeaks is the latest, or at the time, was the latest version of a story that's been told many times before, the idea that new media make for better democracy. And this is an argument that we've heard before, and we can find it in the academic literature. For example, in the literature on something called the muckraking press, muckraking journalism. So if you go to Communications and Mass Media Complete, you will find that there's been a lot that's been written about the rise of a form of investigative journalism called muckraking journalism that was really part and parcel of the growing success of the 19th century newspaper industry as a popular form. If we go back to the 19th century, the newspaper was a source of community engagement, a source of community entertainment. It was something that people really loved to do, to either read the newspaper or have the newspaper read to them. And quite often that was because a lot of the 19th century press in the United Kingdom, but also in America, was very entertaining. It was a mix of sensationalism and investigative journalism, and particularly muckraking journalism refers to a style of journalism that really began in the late 19th century in the United States. And this involved research in journalists who went on to literary success in some cases. Upton Sinclair is a name that springs to mind. But what they would do is they were very interested in corruption in America's new urban centers. And so they specialized, muckraking journalism specialized in stories on, for example, appalling living conditions in new urban centres, or appalling working conditions, or incredible amounts of corruption in city government, and these sorts of things. And very soon, these journalists found that they were really able to have their cake and eat it too, as the expression goes. They were able to do good journalism that really helped people understand the environment in which they live, that made them politically energized, but which was also very entertaining as well. And so there was this kind of happy period in muckraking journalism where it seemed you could please everybody all of the time. You could actually win commercial success by telling news with a social value. But early on, we kind of had this idea that this was very much connected to the rise of the press as a mass medium, because one of the impetuses behind muckraking press was the desire to sell newspapers. Was the idea to, if we heard if you hear the saying yesterday's news, it kind of relates to this idea of the mass press in the 19th century that served a mass audience really needed a quick turnover of news. It needed people not to stay with news stories. It needed an audience who were constantly desperate for the latest scandal, and muckraking journalism served that purpose. I suppose this leads into a second point, which is relevant. This is going to be highly relevant when we get to the Hassian reading, because as the last section indicated, much as muckraking journalism was closely connected to a new form of journalism that fitted a new media form, the mass-produced press, it was also driven significantly by commercial interests. And this is an argument that was also preferred by the Canadian political economist Harold Innis, who argued the main thing that drove the North American mass press and muckraking journalism was the need to sell paper. There was a massive logging industry in North America that needed consumers, and newspapers was where it found them. So Innis's work on the relationship between the press, muckraking journalism, and newspapers was very much based on his somewhat pessimistic view that very often history proved that new communication technologies in many ways made the world less democratic. And certainly with regard to the newspaper, one of the things that he was eager to point out was that the driver behind 19th and 20th century newspapers were the economic needs of the paper industry and transportation needs, and the cultivation for news amongst new audiences was much more about selling paper than it was anything else. And in that sense, what we saw in 19th century muckraking journalism was an urge toward speed of dissemination that perhaps came at the expense of judgment, and certainly wasn't something that was driven by the desire to make for better democratic communication, but which was rather driven by the merger of media industries with business interests and political interests. So this is an important backdrop for the discussion that we're going to have about Hassian, because Hassian also argues that you can't really understand Wikileaks as an impactful media phenomenon unless you understand Wikileaks' business models, and particularly the capacity of that business model to work alongside the business models of established media industries. And then finally, Yevgeny Morozov, who over the last decade or so has been very cautious about the impact of digital media, where many people, such as McNair, have been happy to champion the democratic capacity of new digital media. Morozov is more cautious, is more leaning towards the Innis point of view, and he argues that technologies, again, that digital technologies quite often have not fulfilled their democratic promise, and that's not to say they never can. It's not to say that hope is not really, really important. But it is to say that we need to we need to understand media technologies from the point of view of how their affordances, that is, the unique aspects of digital media technologies, the things that you can do with digital technologies that you can't do with anything else, how those affordances are realized when they're deployed by particular people and particular organizations in particular case studies. So if we go back to our overview of this section, what we can see is that the Wikileaks example falls into a range of optimistic, utopian to dystopian views on the relationship between changing media technologies and democratic participation that's been in play for at least a century. And so in that case, we can, by doing a little bit of reading around in some general media theory, we can learn to understand how something like WikiLeaks is an excellent research topic because it allows us to connect a particular case study with some of the big general ideas about media and social change that typify media and communication studies as an academic discipline.